The February wind cut through Cedar Ridge like a serrated blade, carrying with it the promise of another bitter week ahead. Margaret O'Brien pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she approached the weathered steps of St. Mary's Church, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid morning air. The familiar sound of hymns drifted through the frost-covered windows, but today something felt different, wrong somehow. She had walked this same path every Sunday for the past 3 years, ever since she and Patrick had settled in Wyoming territory after fleeing the poverty of County Cork. Even after Patrick's death 6 months ago, in that terrible accident at Hartwell's cattle crossing, she had continued coming, finding solace in the familiar rituals and community prayers. But as she reached for the heavy oak door handle, Pastor Whitmore's voice boomed from within, causing her to freeze mid-reach. "Let us pray for those among us who have lost their way," the pastor intoned, his words carrying clearly through the thin walls. "For the widow who consorts with heathens and brings shame upon our Christian community." Maggie's hand trembled against the cold metal. She knew with the certainty that comes from months of whispered conversations, cutting short when she entered Miller's general store, that he was speaking about her. The rumors had started shortly after Patrick's funeral, when people learned he had been trading with the Lakota camp east of town. Not unusual business, but somehow scandalous when attached to a dead man's reputation. The door suddenly swung open, revealing Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, her pinched face twisted with righteous indignation. "Margaret O'Brien," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who considered herself a pillar of the community. "Pastor Whitmore has made it clear that your presence is no longer welcome at Sunday services." Behind Mrs. Abernathy, Maggie could see familiar faces. The Hendersons, the Coopers, the blacksmith Davies and his family, all turned toward the commotion, their expressions ranging from pious satisfaction to uncomfortable embarrassment. Not one person met her eyes directly. "Mrs. Abernathy," Maggie began, her Irish accent thickening as it always did when she was distressed. "I've done nothing but try to survive since Patrick's passing. If people have concerns about your husband's dealings with the savages are well known," Mrs. Abernathy interrupted, spitting the words like they tasted bitter, "and your own behavior since his death has been questionable. A proper Christian widow would mourn quietly, not be seen accepting help from that half-breed drifter who skulks around town." The accusation hit Maggie like a physical blow. She thought of Tom McKenzie, the quiet man who had indeed helped her, splitting wood when her supplies ran low, fixing her broken fence gate without being asked, leaving anonymous bags of flour and beans on her doorstep during the worst of the winter storms. She had never asked for his help, never even spoken more than a dozen words to him, but his assistance had kept her alive when the rest of the town seemed determined to let her freeze or starve. "I've committed no sin," Maggie said, drawing herself up to her full height, though she barely reached Mrs. Abernathy's shoulder. "Patrick traded honestly with all people, as any Christian man should, and I've accepted charity from whoever was Christian enough to offer it." "Charity?" Mrs. Abernathy's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Is that what you call it when that mongrel Mackenzie spends his nights watching your cabin, when he brings you gifts like some courting savage?" The words stung, because there was a grain of truth in them, though twisted beyond recognition. Tom did seem to appear whenever she needed help most, and she had wondered how he always knew when her firewood was running low or when her roof needed patching after a storm. But courting? The man barely looked at her directly, much less spoke to her with any familiarity. Pastor Whitmore appeared behind Mrs. Abernathy, his tall frame filling the doorway. His grey beard was perfectly groomed despite the early hour, and his dark eyes held no warmth as they fixed on Maggie. "Mrs. O'Brien, I'm afraid your continued presence here has become disruptive to our congregation's spiritual well-being. Until you can demonstrate proper Christian repentance and distance yourself from unsavory influences, I must ask you to seek spiritual guidance elsewhere." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Around him, the congregation had fallen completely silent, the earlier hymn forgotten. Maggie felt the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her like the heavy snow that had been falling for weeks. "I see," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And who decides what constitutes proper repentance, Pastor? You, Mrs. Abernathy, or perhaps Mr. Hartwell, who's been so interested in purchasing my Patrick's land at such a generous price?" A flush of anger colored the pastor's cheeks. "Your implications are inappropriate and unwelcome. Good day, Mrs. O'Brien." The door closed with a decisive thud, leaving Maggie alone on the church steps with the wind and the weight of her new reality. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the muffled resumption of the service within, feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her life, more alone than when she had buried Patrick, more lost than when she had first arrived in America as a frightened young bride. As she turned to walk back down the snow-covered path, she noticed a figure standing quietly beside the church's side wall, partially hidden in the shadow of the bell tower. Tom McKenzie stepped forward slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers for just a moment before he looked away. He was tall and lean, with the weathered face of a man who spent his life outdoors, and his mixed heritage was evident in his high cheekbones and the bronze tone of his skin. He wore simple working clothes, wool pants, a heavy coat that had seen better years, and boots worn smooth by countless miles. He didn't speak. She had never heard him say more than a few words to anyone in town, but he touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of acknowledgement before melting back into the shadows. Somehow that brief moment of recognition from the town's most marginalized resident felt more like Christian charity than anything she had experienced inside the church. The walk back to her cabin felt longer than usual, each step through the knee-deep snow a reminder of how truly alone she now was. Maggie's small homestead sat at the edge of town, close enough to see the smoke rising from other chimneys, but far enough away that her nearest neighbor, old Henrik the Norwegian trapper, was nearly a quarter-mile distant. Patrick had chosen the location for its proximity to the creek and the good grazing land, dreaming of the day they might expand their small herd of cattle. Now those dreams lay buried with him in the Cedar Ridge cemetery, along with any hope she might have had of belonging in this harsh place. The cabin was cold when she entered, the fire having died down to barely glowing embers. Maggie knelt before the stone hearth, her numb fingers struggling with the flint and steel as she tried to coax new flames from the remaining coals. The wind rattled the shutters Patrick had built with such care, and she could hear the ominous creaking of tree branches weighted down with ice. As she finally managed to get a small flame started, a soft thud against her door made her freeze. Her heart hammered as she listened, remembering Mrs. Abernathy's cruel words about that half-breed drifter who skulks around town. But when she crept to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass, she saw only her empty yard and the endless expanse of white beyond. It wasn't until she opened the door to bring in more firewood from the small pile on her porch that she discovered what had made the sound. 3 fresh-cut logs lay stacked neatly beside her door, still dusted with sawdust, and beside them sat a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside the bundle she found a small sack of coffee beans, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she had been stretching to make last, and a jar of what looked like honey. There was no note, no indication of who had left the gifts, but Maggie knew. Tom McKenzie moved through the world like a shadow, appearing where he was needed and disappearing just as quietly. She had seen him around town for nearly 2 years, doing odd jobs for various ranchers and merchants, but always keeping to himself. The few times she had tried to thank him for his help, he had simply nodded and walked away, as if words were too precious to waste. She brought the wood inside and added 2 logs to her fire, feeling guilty about the luxury even as she savored the increased warmth. The coffee she saved for later, knowing that such a treasure should be rationed carefully. As the afternoon wore on and the storm outside intensified, she found herself wondering about her silent benefactor. What drove a man to help someone he barely knew, and why did he choose to help her when doing so clearly associated him with the town's most unwelcome resident? The answer came partially the next morning, when she woke to find her small vegetable garden had been cleared of snow and her chicken coop repaired where the wind had torn a board loose. More telling, though, were the tracks she found in the fresh snow around her cabin, not just Tom's boots, but the paw prints of what looked like a large dog, and beyond those, the distinctive hoofprints of unshod horses. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the significance. Someone had been watching her cabin during the night, someone with horses who didn't shoe their mounts in the white man's fashion. The tracks led back toward the eastern hills, where she knew the Lakota winter camp was located, but Tom's boot prints told a different story. They circled her cabin like a protective barrier, and in several places she could see where he had stood motionless for long periods, watching and waiting. Whatever threat had approached in the night, he had been there to meet it. The realization both comforted and terrified her. She was grateful for the protection, but the implications were staggering. If Pastor Whitmore and Mrs. Abernathy thought her association with Tom was scandalous now, what would they say if they knew he was spending his nights guarding her cabin? And why was he doing it? Her questions were partially answered 3 days later, when the worst blizzard of the winter struck Cedar Ridge with a fury that reminded everyone why Wyoming territory was still considered the edge of civilization. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow horizontal across the landscape and dropping visibility to mere feet. Maggie huddled by her fire, listening to the cabin groan under the assault and praying the roof would hold. When the storm finally broke on the second day, she emerged to find her world transformed. Snow had drifted against her cabin wall nearly to the roofline, and her carefully hoarded firewood pile had completely disappeared. Worse, when she struggled through the drifts to check on her chickens, she discovered that part of the coop's roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. She was standing there in the bitter cold, staring at the destruction and fighting back tears of despair, when she heard the soft sound of footsteps crunching through the snow behind her. She turned to find Tom McKenzie approaching, a shovel in one hand and a toolbox in the other. For the first time since she had known of his existence, he spoke directly to her. His voice was quiet, roughened by the cold, and tinged with an accent she couldn't quite place, part Scottish, part something else entirely. "Storm's past," he said, his dark eyes taking in the damage to her coop and the drifted snow blocking her door. "Chickens need shelter before the next one hits." "Mr. McKenzie," she began, but he was already moving toward the collapsed coop, setting down his tools and beginning to assess what needed to be done. "Tom," he corrected without looking at her. "No need for formality between neighbors." Neighbors. The word carried weight in a place like Cedar Ridge, implying mutual obligation and respect that extended far beyond mere proximity. As she watched him work, efficiently clearing snow and examining the damaged boards, Maggie realized that Tom McKenzie had claimed her as his responsibility in a way that went beyond simple charity. "Why?" she asked finally, the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. "Why do you help me when it brings you nothing but trouble?" Tom paused in his work, his hands still on a broken board. For a long moment, he was silent, and Maggie thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured as if each one had been carefully considered. "Your husband," he said slowly, "was a good man, fair in his dealings, respectful to all people. When he died, the debt passed to the living." "Debt?" Tom resumed his work, pulling away the damaged boards. "A man shows kindness to my people when others show only fear and hatred. That kindness creates obligation. Your husband fed Lakota children when they were hungry, traded fairly when others would cheat. Such actions are remembered." The revelation stunned her. Patrick had never mentioned his interactions with the local tribes, beyond noting that they were decent folk, just trying to get by like anyone else. She had known he traded with them occasionally, but she hadn't realized the extent or the nature of those relationships. "So you help his widow out of duty?" she asked, not sure whether to be grateful or offended. Tom looked at her directly then, his dark eyes serious. "Started as duty," he said quietly. "Now," he trailed off, returning his attention to the broken coop. That unfinished sentence hung in the cold air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them seemed ready to explore. The repair of Maggie's chicken coop took most of the morning, and by the time Tom finished reinforcing the roof with new boards, the sun was casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Maggie had insisted on helping despite his initial protests, handing him tools and holding boards in place while he worked. It was the most time they had ever spent in each other's company, and she found herself stealing glances at his weathered hands as they worked with practiced efficiency. "Thank you," she said as he packed his tools back into the wooden box. "I don't know how I can repay—" "No payment needed," Tom interrupted, but not unkindly. He shouldered his toolbox and looked toward the town, where smoke was rising from various chimneys. "Storm damaged other places too. Should check on Henrik, make sure the old man's all right." As he turned to leave, the sound of approaching horses made them both look toward the main road. 3 riders were making their way through the snowdrifts, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Even at a distance, Maggie could make out the distinctive black coat and silver-banded hat of Samuel Hartwell, Cedar Ridge's most prosperous cattle rancher. The 2 men with him were his foremen, Jake Morrison and Bull Henley, both known for their quick tempers and quicker fists. "Trouble," Tom said quietly, setting his toolbox down and moving slightly closer to Maggie's side. Hartwell reined in his horse at the edge of Maggie's yard, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene with obvious displeasure. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the soft look of someone who had grown prosperous while others did the hard work. His gaze lingered on Tom with particular distaste before settling on Maggie. "Mrs. O'Brien," Hartwell said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending. "I trust you weathered the storm well?" "Well enough, Mr. Hartwell," Maggie replied, crossing her arms against the cold and the unwelcome scrutiny. "I couldn't help but notice you've been receiving assistance from certain unsavory elements." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Tom, who stood motionless beside the repaired chicken coop. "As a concerned neighbor, I feel obligated to point out that such associations could be misinterpreted by good Christian folk." "My associations are my own business," Maggie said, her Irish temper beginning to flare despite the danger she sensed in the situation. Hartwell's smile was thin and cold. Of course, though I wonder if you've given proper thought to your future here in Cedar Ridge. A woman alone, especially one with a questionable reputation, might find life quite difficult as winter drags on." The threat was barely veiled. Jake Morrison, a thin man with hard eyes and a perpetual sneer, leaned forward in his saddle. "Seems to me a decent Christian woman would be grateful for Mr. Hartwell's concern," he said, his voice carrying the hint of violence that hung around him like a bad smell. Tom stepped forward then, not dramatically but with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down greater threats than 3 mounted bullies. He didn't speak, but his presence seemed to shift the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "McKenzie," Hartwell acknowledged, his tone growing noticeably harder, "I wasn't aware you were in the business of home repair, though I suppose a man of your background takes work where he can find it." "Man takes work that needs doing," Tom replied evenly. "Widow's coop needed fixing." "How generous of you," Hartwell said, the false pleasantry in his voice making it clear he meant anything but, "though I can't help wondering what other services you might be providing to our lonely widow here." Maggie felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Mr. Hartwell, your implications are both unwelcome and untrue. Mr. McKenzie has been nothing but respectful, which is more than I can say for—" Now, Hartwell interrupted, raising a gloved hand. "No need to get upset. I'm simply looking out for your best interests. A woman in your position needs to be careful about appearances." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "In fact, I've been giving considerable thought to your situation. This property of yours, it's quite isolated, quite vulnerable, not really suitable for a woman alone." Here it comes, Maggie thought. She had been expecting this conversation ever since Patrick's death, when Hartwell had first approached her about selling the land. Patrick's homestead sat on some of the best grazing land in the area, with reliable water access and natural windbreaks that made it valuable far beyond its modest size. "My offer still stands," Hartwell continued. $300 for the entire property, more than generous considering the circumstances. "The circumstances being that you've helped ensure I have no other options?" Maggie asked, her voice sharp with accusation. Hartwell's expression didn't change, but she saw the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Mrs. O'Brien. I'm simply a businessman making a reasonable offer to help a neighbor in distress." $300 wouldn't buy her passage back east, Tom said quietly. It was the first time he had directly challenged Hartwell, and the temperature in the yard seemed to drop even further. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Breed," Bull Henley snarled from his horse. He was a large man with scarred knuckles and the look of someone who enjoyed using his fists to solve problems. Tom's expression didn't change, but Maggie saw his hands relax at his sides in a way that somehow seemed more threatening than if he had clenched them into fists. "Wasn't offering opinion," he said calmly, stating fact. The tension stretched taut between the men, and Maggie realized she was witnessing something that could easily turn violent. In the frontier code of honor that governed places like Cedar Ridge, Henley's insult demanded a response, and Tom's quiet dignity somehow made his restraint seem more dangerous than rage would have. "Gentlemen," Hartwell said smoothly, apparently deciding he had made his point, "there's no need for unpleasantness. Mrs. O'Brien, I'll give you until spring to consider my offer. A woman in your position shouldn't make hasty decisions, after all." He turned his horse away, but paused to look back at Tom. "McKenzie, a word of advice. A man with your particular heritage would do well to avoid situations that might be misunderstood by the community. Cedar Ridge has always been a peaceful town. It would be unfortunate if that were to change." The 3 men rode away, leaving Maggie and Tom standing in the snow-covered yard, with the weight of implied threats hanging in the air between them. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Maggie realized she was trembling, not from cold, but from anger and fear. "He's behind it," she said, her voice shaking. "Hartwell's behind the rumors, behind Pastor Whitmore turning the congregation against me. He wants my land, and he's making sure I have no choice but to sell." Tom nodded grimly. "A man like Hartwell gets what he wants one way or another. Question is what you plan to do about it." Maggie looked at her small cabin, at the repaired chicken coop, at the land Patrick had loved so much. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt something other than grief and despair. She felt the hot burn of righteous anger. "I plan to fight," she said firmly. "This is my home. Patrick's buried in Cedar Ridge Cemetery, and I'll be damned if I let Samuel Hartwell steal everything we worked for." Tom studied her face for a long moment, as if evaluating her resolve. Finally, he nodded. "Fighting Hartwell means fighting the whole town. You ready for that? Are you?" she asked, meeting his dark eyes directly. The question hung between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis. Tom picked up his toolbox again, but before he turned to leave, he looked back at her with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Reckon we'll find out," he said quietly, and walked away into the gathering dusk. The week following Hartwell's visit brought an unseasonably warm spell that turned the snow to slush and filled the air with the sound of dripping water and creaking ice. Maggie took advantage of the brief reprieve to venture into town for supplies, knowing she couldn't avoid the necessity forever, despite the hostile reception she was sure to receive. Miller's general store was nearly empty when she entered, which she counted as a small blessing. Old Henry Miller looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who wished he could be anywhere else, but his wife Martha emerged from the back room with a face set in hard lines of disapproval. "Mrs. O'Brien," Martha said curtly, not bothering with any pretense of warmth. "I'm afraid we're running short on most items. The storm, you understand." Maggie looked around the well-stocked store, noting the full shelves and abundant supplies. "I only need coffee, flour, and lamp oil, simple items." "Coffee's dear this time of year," Henry said apologetically, avoiding his wife's sharp look. "Supply wagons haven't been getting through regular like." "How dear?" Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. $2 a pound, Martha said with satisfaction. The price was nearly 3 times what coffee usually cost, even in winter. Maggie felt her carefully hoarded savings dwindle further as she counted out the coins, knowing she had little choice but to pay or go without. As she placed her money on the counter, the store's bell chimed, and Pastor Whitmore entered, followed by Mrs. Abernathy and 2 other churchwomen Maggie recognized but had never spoken to directly. The temperature in the store seemed to drop back to winter levels as the group took in her presence. Pastor Whitmore's greeting to the Millers was warm and familiar, but he pointedly ignored Maggie's existence entirely, as if she were nothing more than an unwelcome shadow. "Henry," the pastor said jovially, "I trust you'll be donating your usual generous contribution to the church's spring social fund. Mrs. Abernathy has been working tirelessly to organize what promises to be our finest community gathering yet." "Of course, Pastor," Henry replied, though Maggie noticed his eyes kept darting uncomfortably between her and the church group, "always happy to support community events." "Wonderful," Mrs. Abernathy chimed in, her voice carrying clearly through the small space. "It's so important that good Christian families come together to strengthen our moral bonds, especially in times when certain influences threaten to corrupt our community's values." The pointed nature of her comments was impossible to ignore. Maggie felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain silent as Henry wrapped her purchases in brown paper with hands that shook slightly. "Speaking of moral influences," Pastor Whitmore said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used from the pulpit, "I've been hearing disturbing reports about certain associations that are causing concern among our faithful congregation." Maggie realized with growing horror that she was about to become the subject of a very public condemnation. The other women in the group were watching her with the avid attention of vultures circling wounded prey. "Pastor," Henry began weakly, "perhaps this isn't the best place." "On the contrary," Whitmore interrupted, "sunlight is the best disinfectant for moral corruption, Henry. When a member of our community chooses to associate with heathens and half-breeds, when she flaunts Christian decency by accepting inappropriate gifts and services from men of questionable character, it becomes the duty of righteous people to speak plainly." The words hit Maggie like physical blows. She clutched her wrapped purchases to her chest and tried to move toward the door, but Mrs. Abernathy stepped deliberately into her path. "Running away won't solve your problems, Margaret," the banker's wife said with false sweetness. What you need is honest counsel from Christian women who have your spiritual welfare at heart. What I need, Maggie said, her Irish accent thickening with emotion, is to be left in peace to grieve my husband and live my life without interference from people who seem to have forgotten the meaning of Christian charity. Christian charity. Pastor Whitmore's voice rose with righteous indignation. Is that what you call your shameful behavior? A decent woman would have sold her property and returned to her family in the East, not lingered here to become the subject of scandalous gossip. Scandalous gossip that seems to serve certain people's interests quite well, Maggie shot back, her temper finally overcoming her caution. How convenient that my supposed moral failings make it easier for Mr. Hartwell to pressure me into selling my land at a fraction of its worth. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Pastor Whitmore's face reddened, and Mrs. Abernathy drew herself up with offended dignity. How dare you imply that godly people would conspire in worldly matters, the pastor sputtered. Your paranoia is simply further evidence of your deteriorated spiritual condition. My spiritual condition is between me and God, Maggie replied firmly, not between me and Samuel Hartwell's bank account. She pushed past Mrs. Abernathy and headed for the door, but the woman's next words stopped her cold. Everyone knows what kind of services that half-breed McKenzie provides to lonely widows, Mrs. Abernathy said with vicious satisfaction. Perhaps if you examined your own behavior, you'd understand why decent people find it necessary to protect their families from your influence. Maggie spun around, her face blazing with anger. Thomas McKenzie is a better Christian than any of you, despite never setting foot in your church. He feeds the hungry, helps those in need, and asks nothing in return. If you can't see the difference between Christian charity and Christian hypocrisy, then perhaps you need to examine your own souls. She stormed out of the store, her heart pounding with rage and humiliation. The warm afternoon air felt stifling after the tension inside, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, trying to collect herself. The confrontation had been a disaster. She had only made things worse for both herself and Tom. As she started to walk home, she heard quick footsteps behind her. She turned to find Henry Miller approaching, looking nervous but determined. Mrs. O'Brien, he called quietly, glancing back toward his store. Wait a moment, please. She stopped, unsure what to expect. Henry was a kind man, but she knew he depended on the goodwill of the community for his livelihood. I wanted to apologize, he said, his voice low, for Martha's behavior, for the prices. It isn't right what's happening to you. Then why don't you do something about it, Maggie asked, though without real anger. She could see the genuine distress in the older man's face. Henry sighed heavily. You know why. Hartwell holds the note on my store, same as he holds notes on half the businesses in town. Man crosses him, he calls in debts that can't be paid. I've got grandchildren to think about. The admission only confirmed what Maggie had suspected. Hartwell's influence extended far beyond his cattle ranch. He had woven himself into the economic fabric of Cedar Ridge so thoroughly that opposing him meant risking everything. I understand, she said softly. No, you don't, Henry replied with surprising firmness. But maybe you should know something that might help you understand the whole picture. He glanced around nervously before continuing. Your husband, Patrick, he never told you about the real reason Hartwell wants your land, did he? Maggie shook her head, confused. There's copper on your property, Mrs. O'Brien. Maybe silver, too. Patrick found traces of it near the creek last fall, had some samples assayed in Cheyenne without telling anyone. Hartwell found out somehow. He always finds out about things like that. Your husband's death wasn't the accident everyone thinks it was. The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. What are you saying? I'm saying Patrick O'Brien was too good a horseman to fall off his mount crossing a creek he'd crossed 100 times before. And I'm saying the man who found his body was Jake Morrison, who happened to be riding alone that day instead of with the other hands like usual. Henry looked around again, his nervousness increasing. I can't prove anything, and I'd deny saying this if asked. But you deserve to know what you're really fighting for, and what kind of man you're fighting against. With that, he hurried back toward his store, leaving Maggie standing alone on the sidewalk with her world fundamentally changed. Patrick hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered for the mineral wealth hidden beneath their modest homestead, and now Hartwell was using the entire community to pressure her into giving up not just her home, but potentially a fortune in precious metals. As she walked home through the slush and mud, Maggie felt the weight of this new knowledge settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was no longer just fighting for her home and her dignity. She was fighting for justice for Patrick's death, but she was also more aware than ever of just how dangerous Samuel Hartwell truly was, and how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted. The question now was whether she and Tom could survive long enough to expose the truth, or whether they would simply become two more unfortunate accidents in Cedar Ridge's recent history. The weeks leading up to Easter passed in a tense standoff. Hartwell made no further direct approaches, but his presence hung over Maggie's daily life like a storm cloud. Supplies became harder to obtain, prices continued to rise, and the social isolation deepened until even Henrik, her Norwegian neighbor, stopped acknowledging her when their paths crossed. Tom's presence became more constant, but no less subtle. He worked on various projects around her property, mending fences, clearing drainage ditches, preparing her small garden plot for spring planting, but he seemed to sense that too much visible association would only make things worse for both of them. Their conversations remained brief, though Maggie found herself treasuring each quiet exchange. It was during one of these encounters, as Tom helped her repair storm damage to her roof, that she finally told him what Henry Miller had revealed about Patrick's death and the mineral deposits on her land. Tom listened without interruption, his face growing harder with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, methodically driving nails with more force than necessary. "Changes things," he said finally. "How so?" "Murder's not something a man walks away from, even out here. Hartwell knows you know he'll have to act soon. Can't let you leave Cedar Ridge alive to tell the story elsewhere." The blunt assessment sent a chill through Maggie that had nothing to do with the spring wind. "Then what do we do?" Tom set down his hammer and looked at her directly. "We make him come to us, on ground of our choosing, and we make sure the whole town sees what kind of man he really is." "How?" "Easter Sunday," Tom said quietly. "Biggest gathering of the year. Everyone will be at church, including Hartwell. Time to break some silence." The plan he outlined was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. Tom would escort Maggie to Easter services, publicly challenging both the pastor's ban and the community's rejection. The confrontation would force Hartwell to either back down publicly or reveal his true nature in front of the entire congregation. "It's too risky," Maggie protested. "If we're wrong about how people will react, then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Tom replied. "But if we're right, if there are still decent people in Cedar Ridge who remember what Christian charity actually means, maybe we can turn the tide." Easter Sunday dawned clear and bright, with the first real warmth of spring in the air. Maggie dressed in her best remaining dress, a simple blue wool that Patrick had always said brought out her eyes, and waited nervously by her window. She had spent the previous sleepless night alternating between determination and terror, knowing that the next few hours would likely determine her fate. Tom arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, leading 2 horses. He was dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, in clean pants and a white shirt that emphasized his mixed heritage rather than hiding it. His long dark hair was neatly braided in the Lakota fashion, and he wore a silver cross on a leather cord around his neck. "Ready?" he asked simply. "No," Maggie replied honestly, "but let's go anyway." The ride to town was conducted in companionable silence, but Maggie could feel Tom's alertness as they approached the church. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, and she noticed he kept his rifle within easy reach on his saddle. The congregation was already gathering when they arrived, families in their Easter finery chatting and laughing on the church steps. The conversations died away as Maggie and Tom approached, replaced by the kind of electric tension that precedes a thunderstorm. Pastor Whitmore emerged from the church and stopped dead when he saw them. His face cycled through surprise, anger, and something that might have been fear before settling into cold authority. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I believe I made myself clear about your welcome here." "You did indeed, Pastor," Maggie replied, dismounting from her horse with Tom's assistance. "But I've come to worship on Easter morning, as is my right as a Christian woman. Your behavior has made it clear you've abandoned Christian principles," Mrs. Abernathy interjected, stepping forward with several other churchwomen. "And bringing that half-breed with you only confirms your fallen state." Tom stepped slightly forward, not threateningly, but with quiet dignity. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the churchyard. "I came to escort Mrs. O'Brien to Easter services," he said calmly, "same as any Christian man would escort a lady to church." "You're not a Christian," Jake Morrison snarled from the crowd. "You're a savage, just like your heathen relatives." "Am I?" Tom asked mildly. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a worn Bible, its leather cover marked by years of use. Then perhaps someone can explain why I know Scripture better than men who claim to follow Christ but turn away widows and orphans." The appearance of the Bible clearly surprised many in the crowd. Tom opened it to a marked page and began to read in a clear, steady voice. "Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world." James chapter 1 verse 27. He closed the book and looked directly at Pastor Whitmore. "Been visiting this widow in her affliction, Pastor, have you?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Pastor Whitmore's face reddened, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Touching performance, McKenzie," Samuel Hartwell said as he approached from the street, flanked by Jake Morrison and Bull Henley, "though I suspect your interpretation of Scripture might differ from that of civilized Christians." Tom turned to face Hartwell, and Maggie saw something change in his posture, a subtle shift that somehow made him seem more dangerous, despite his quiet demeanor. "Mr. Hartwell," Tom acknowledged, "didn't expect to see you at Easter services. Thought you might be too busy making widows to worry about comforting them." The accusation was delivered so quietly that many in the crowd probably missed its significance, but Hartwell's face went pale with rage. "What exactly are you implying?" he demanded. "Implying nothing," Tom replied evenly. "Stating fact. Patrick O'Brien was murdered for the minerals on his land. Everyone here knows it, even if they're too scared to say it." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Henry Miller stepped forward from the back of the group, his face pale but determined. "It's true," he said in a shaking voice. "Patrick found copper traces on his property, had them assayed in Cheyenne. Hartwell found out somehow." "You're lying!" Morrison shouted, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "Am I?" Henry shot back, finding courage in the moment. "Then explain why you were the only one riding alone the day Patrick died. Explain why you happened to find his body so convenient-like." The crowd was beginning to turn, Maggie realized. The seed of doubt had been planted, and people were starting to remember their own suspicions and fears about Hartwell's growing power in the community. Hartwell seemed to sense the shift as well. His mask of respectability was slipping, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "This is ridiculous," he snarled. "You're all going to take the word of a half-breed savage and a disgraced widow over respected members of the community?" "Respected?" Tom asked quietly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Found this in Morrison's saddlebags when I was checking his horse for stones yesterday. Interesting reading." He unfolded the paper and held it up. Even from a distance, Maggie could see it was some kind of document with official seals. "Airsaier's report from Cheyenne," Tom announced, dated 2 weeks before Patrick O'Brien's death, signed by Jake Morrison as the submitter of the samples. The implications hit the crowd like a physical blow. Morrison's face went white, and his hand dropped to his gun. "You thieving breed!" he shouted, drawing his weapon. But Tom was faster. His own gun appeared in his hand with the fluid grace of long practice, and Morrison found himself staring down the barrel before his own weapon had cleared leather. "Wouldn't," Tom said quietly. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then Pastor Whitmore's voice cut through the tension. "Stop," he said firmly, stepping between the two men. "This is God's house, and Easter morning. There will be no bloodshed here." For a moment, it seemed Morrison might ignore the pastor's words, but the weight of the crowd's attention and the steady look in Tom's eyes finally made him slowly holster his gun. Hartwell looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that were no longer friendly, no longer trusting. His carefully constructed web of influence was unraveling before his eyes. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, it is," Maggie said, stepping forward to stand beside Tom. "Because I'm not selling my land, Mr. Hartwell. Not to you, not to anyone. And if anything happens to me, or to Tom, that assayer's report goes straight to the territorial marshal, along with Henry Miller's testimony about what really happened to my husband." Hartwell stared at her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked away, Morrison and Henley trailing behind him like whipped dogs. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people talking in hushed, excited voices about what they had witnessed. Pastor Whitmore stood on the church steps, looking uncertain for perhaps the first time in his life. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said finally, perhaps I was hasty in my judgment. If you and Mr. McKenzie would like to join us for Easter services." "Thank you, Pastor," Maggie replied with quiet dignity. "We would be honored." As they climbed the church steps together, Tom leaned close to her ear. "Still think it's too risky?" he asked, and she could hear the hint of a smile in his voice. "Ask me again after the service," Maggie replied, but for the first time in months she felt hope blooming in her chest, like the first flowers of spring. Behind them, the bells of St. Mary's began to ring, calling the faithful to worship on Easter morning, and for the first time since Patrick's death, Maggie O'Brien walked through those doors with her head held high, no longer alone in her fight for justice and dignity in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier.